is TWiP. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of This Week in Photo. I'm your host, Frederick Van Johnson. Today is going to be an interesting discussion, one that I've been waiting for a while now. Just a little bit of backstory on this. I used to be, when I worked at Adobe, I was on the Lightroom Photoshop team, specifically the Lightroom team. So I have an affinity for Lightroom. I remember internally at the company, kind of it wasn't a rivalry between the Bridge crew and the Lightroom crew, but it was definitely, you guys are overstepping here, or why are you putting that feature in when it's, it was that kind of feel. I don't know if it's still that way now. This is many years ago, but as a result of that, I definitely have a line in my tree rings of Lightroom, right? So, and not so much of Bridge for that reason, because it's like, hey, Lightroom is the way forward. I'm using Lightroom. I'm a photographer. Adobe built it for photographers. That's me. I'm going to use that tool and forsake all others. Fast forward to some of my conversations with this guy, Blake Rudis, who doesn't necessarily use Lightroom. And, just to put this in a box, I'm speaking with Blake. I don't even know if you know this. I'm speaking with Matt Kloskowski and Dave Cross shortly, hopefully either this week or next week, about Lightroom, right? So we're going to talk about their experience. It's going to be very similar to this conversation. But from what I've learned from our conversations, Blake Rudis, the evolution and the growth of Bridge and its capabilities and integration with Photoshop, it means that we should be taking another look at it. And if you're a Lightroom exclusive purist, that combination bears some looking at now, especially because of smart objects and how everything kind of works together. So all that to say, welcome Blake Rudis to the show. We're going to dive in and talk about this. Blake, before we dive in, I know a lot of the people in the TWiP audience know who you are already, but for the people who don't, can you give us a little primer on who the Rudis is?
Sure thing. So I'm Blake Rudis. I'm the host of F64Academy.com, and I'm pretty much like a Photoshop, addict. If there's a group for people like me, then I would probably be the leader. I eat, sleep, and breathe Photoshop in there all the time. And my goal is essentially to make Photoshop, which is a very convoluted piece of software, very simple for people who want to make their images better and, more importantly, make experiences for their viewers. And I feel very strongly that Photoshop is a place for that. So I have never used Lightroom. I did once. Wow. That was a long time ago. So I've really been on this Photoshop kick. And because of that, I kind of have to be married to Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw because I don't use Lightroom. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Let's talk about that before just to set the stage. We're going to use just a little bit of the time with you and I dialoguing back and forth, and then I'm going to let you just show some magic within Photoshop to kind of sell what you're talking about. So the Lightroom v Photoshop argument, if there is an argument there, set the stage there. So when I look at Lightroom, as a former Adobe employee and as someone who uses it almost every day now, I look at it as a tool that, like I said before, was built for photographers and strips away all the stuff that you don't need in Photoshop proper so that you can focus on the photo itself. It's photo specific with its localized adjustment tools and raw processing, obviously Camera Raw engine, but raw processing, all that stuff is very specific focused to what I want to do as a photographer. When I look at the Photoshop Bridge combination, it makes me feel like, okay, I'm going from mom and pop hardware store to Home Depot or Lowe's, and I got to figure out what I want to do. Can I just go over here and get my nail, from the mom and pop shop? How do you set the stage? Like, what keeps you inside as a photographer? Because you're a very accomplished photographer as well as an educator. How do you reconcile not using a tool that was built specifically for photography versus a Hydra like Photoshop Bridge?
For sure. So we got to go way back. So I've been using Photoshop since 1998, I believe. So I've been in Photoshop for like 23 some years, right? Lightroom came out around 2006, 2007. And I only remember that because right before I went to Afghanistan, I downloaded Lightroom, put it on my laptop and said, I'm going to learn this while I'm gone. Right. So I'm in Afghanistan. You do go to war too when you go to war, just so everyone knows. Yeah. But there is some downtime in between the other stuff. So I'm sitting there in my office and I'm trying to learn for Lightroom while I'm doing my paces there. And as I'm digging into it, I open up an image and I'm like, this is all I can do. Why would I want this? Like, I'm so used to Photoshop with unlimited possibilities. When I saw Lightroom, it was more like, this is just like a dark room, but they call it Lightroom. That's cute. So, for that reason, it was very interesting at first, trying to understand why Adobe made Lightroom when I was so used to Photoshop. Then I started digging into raw files and understanding that Lightroom was basically a conduit to open raw files so that you could then transport those raw files into Photoshop, which, if we look at Adobe Camera Raw and Bridge, is essentially the same thing as Lightroom. It's just two different programs that a lot of people don't realize. So really, I don't think it's a Lightroom versus Photoshop thing. And I'll take this back to when I was in the darkroom back in like my high school days. So there was a one time when I developed a print, and it was funny. It was a really cool print. I got pulled over by a cop on my way to go photograph the beach because I wanted to get there before sunset when I was in high school. So I leaned back in my chair and I took a picture. It was my Canon AE1 with film of the cop in the rear view. And then I ended up processing that on a piece of canvas photo paper, which I then colored with oils. Okay, so this is going somewhere. So what I essentially did there was the process of going from Lightroom into Photoshop from the analog film darkroom days. So if we think about this, I processed the negative, which was like Lightroom. I adjusted the exposure in the enlarger, which is like Lightroom. And then once I had the print and it was done, it was handed off over to my desk, which then was the place where I was colorizing things and getting artistic, which would be Photoshop. Yeah. So if we think about these as two separate entities, it's a lot easier for people. I've never thought of Lightroom versus Photoshop. I've always thought of it as Lightroom and Photoshop. So Lightroom is where you get the preliminary stuff done. Photoshop is where you can do some refinements. But it's up to you as to what you consider preliminary, right? So I might not go that far in Lightroom. I might, or Adobe Camera Raw, since I'm speaking for Adobe Camera Raw, but I might not go that far in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. Whereas I get it to a certain point and then hand it off to Photoshop and then do the rest of my work.
Can you help us understand what the differences and where each one of these things come into play? So we've got Camera Raw, right? Mm-hmm. Which is an app, right? It's not just a format. People think, oh, Camera Raw, that is a format that is raw. That's the raw processing engine that Adobe has created, which is true, but it also manifests as an app on the computer. So we've got Camera Raw, we've got Bridge, we've got Lightroom, and then we've got Photoshop, in which you can put a Camera Raw layer, right? Or a Camera Raw adjustment layer inside of Photoshop. So for raw that we have to contend with, a lot of people, myself included, are going to say, you know what, I don't know when to use which or whatever. I'm just going to process my flower in Lightroom and export it and be happy with it. Why all the complexity? And what does all that complexity give me? Can you take those things one by one and kind of set the stage there?
Sure. So think of Lightroom as your all-in-one printer, right? It's got, it prints, it scans, it faxes, and what else can an all-in-one printer do? But it does everything, right? So take those elements away from there and you can have individual things. You could have an individual scanner, you could have an individual printer, you could have an individual fax, right? So basically what Lightroom is think of Lightroom as Bridge plus Adobe Camera Raw is Lightroom. So Bridge is essentially if you're like me using Bridge to go into Adobe Camera Raw, Bridge becomes the way that you catalog and organize your photographs, but it doesn't catalog and organize your photographs within Bridge, which that's where things get a little funky. So like me, I open Lightroom and it's like, hey, what do you want to do with your pictures? I'm like, hey, I don't want you to do anything with my pictures. Why are you trying to micromanage my pictures? Like, that's what I say. I'm like, no, I don't want you to touch this. And then I try to get a picture into Lightroom. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, I can't even import one photo in here. I got to do it. It's so nerve wracking for me that every time I open, the only reason why I open Lightroom and have it installed is so I can do installation demos for when I make presets and profiles. That's it.
Interesting.
So now we take that element and we talk about a Bridge meets Adobe Camera Raw. So Bridge now becomes the cataloging portion of Lightroom, but it doesn't catalog anything. Yes, it's a viewer.
It's looking at a file hierarchy, right? It's not moving, importing, adjusting. It's just, you're just saying, here, my photos are right here in this photos directory, and I've got them organized. Just mirror that inside the app, right?
Exactly. So Bridge just becomes a way to look at how I organize my photos. So if I'm not a very organized person, well, guess what? Bridge is not going to work for me. But I developed a way to a hierarchy back in 1998 when I was doing my photography, so that I could organize all my photos in a way that Lightroom kind of already does, by date, by location, and so on and so forth. So in my windows, when I want to import my photos, I don't import photos. I plug my card in and I drag them and drop them from my card to my computer. Boom, that's it. Then if I want to look at them very quickly, I open Bridge and I just tell it where that folder is, which is just a highlight of copy paste, right? Well, then from Adobe, from Bridge, you can actually do cataloging things where you make favorites, you make smart collections, you make collections. So in that, it's very similar to what Lightroom can do, because not only is it a viewer, but it also has these kind of ghost states as to what might be a favorite. So if I make a smart collection and that smart collection is pictures of Chicago, then if I tell it where the pictures of Chicago are in my computer, it doesn't move them on my computer. It just does all that in the interface of Bridge. So Bridge just becomes like a window, and all the little things, or let's say a refrigerator, and you can move the magnets. The magnets are still on the refrigerator. You're just moving them, so to speak, right? Yeah. So then where does Adobe Camera Raw fit into this? Well, Adobe Camera Raw is essentially the raw editor that you cannot bring a raw file into Photoshop, right? So Photoshop, the program itself, can't necessarily read a raw file. So what it does is when you bring a raw file, you can try and drag and drop a raw file into Photoshop. It will not open the raw file. It's going to port it through Adobe Camera Raw. So I have two ways of opening photos. If I'm lazy and I don't want to go into Bridge because I know where my photos already are, I just go to where it is on my computer, drag it and drop it into Photoshop, and then I can edit in Adobe Camera Raw, right? So Adobe Camera Raw becomes the viewer for a raw file to get it from the raw state to a state that Photoshop can handle, which becomes like a PSD or a TIFF, depending on your workflow, right? So then at that point, Adobe Camera Raw is the same thing as the develop module in Lightroom. So if we go back a little bit,
the same, right?
Exact same thing.
Slider for slider, same.
Slider for slider. Yep. Okay. The only difference is that they'll be in different locations. And the only real difference is like adjustment brushes, local corrections. There's no opacity slider in Adobe Camera Raw, like there is like a density slider or something like that in Lightroom. So that's like the only difference. The only difference. Every tool that you see in Adobe Camera Raw is going to be in Lightroom, and every Lightroom tool is going to be in Adobe Camera Raw. They have subtle nuances, like in Lightroom, if you want to make a color selection, you have a grid pattern. You can either go a small grid or a large grid, right? To make a white balance adjustment. Well, in Adobe Camera Raw, you can press and hold Shift and you can select the whole image to white balance from. So there's a difference between some tools have subtle nuances where Lightroom might be better. And then there's other nuances where Adobe Camera Raw is better. So really, there's not a whole lot outside of that in the develop module that's different. Things are going to look different, yes. But when it comes to form and function, it's almost the exact same thing.
You're not giving anything up by going in a Photoshop sort of Camera Raw Bridge direction versus a Lightroom direction, other than arguably less complexity for the users that want that on the Lightroom side, right? So, in your opinion, as a user, obviously you don't speak for Adobe, neither do I, but in your educated opinion, who is Adobe? What type of person does Adobe want to use each one of these workflows? Who is it? Is it the beginner, advanced, amateur, and they want those people that are intimidated by Photoshop to just, hey, here's Lightroom, go to town, make amazing stuff, and then when you're ready, move over to a Lightroom or to a Photoshop Bridge Camera Raw workflow? Or is it, are you a compositing artist or somebody of that ilk that needs to do that heavy-handed, multi-layered smart object stuff? You need to be over here in Bridge, and Photoshop and Lightroom is not really for you. How do you think they split that up?
Well, I think the thing about Photoshop is that it can be for anyone, for everything under the sun, right? You can do 3D stuff there. You can do photo editing there. You can do compositing there. You can do layers. You can do masking. There is no end to what Photoshop can do, except for what the user wants to use it for. So I've always hated that phrase photoshopped. Like when someone says, oh, is this photoshopped? Well, what do you mean? Do you mean, did I make some lips bigger and a butt smaller than with the liquify tool? Whatever. Yeah. But when you're talking to a landscape photographer and they say, is this photoshopped? It's like, well, I mean, what do you mean by that? Because I did use Photoshop, but it doesn't mean I put a tree where a tree didn't exist. I could if I wanted to. What I think that really what it comes down to is that Photoshop, it is the refinement tool, in my personal opinion. That's how I use it. So I have a workflow that I use. It's called tone, color, artistic effects. And in this, I want to get tonal accuracy for the scene that I documented. I want to get color accuracy for the scene that I documented. And then I give myself permission to do artistic effects. And it has to go in that order, because it's like working out and eating food. I always say this term to my subscribers: crap in, crap out. If I eat a hamburger and expect to go do a 3-mile run and not, throw up, no, guess what? I ate crap. It's going to happen. Same thing is going to happen in your raw processing workflow. If you bring a bad looking photograph into Photoshop in the refinement stage, in the effect stage, and think that you're going to make a great looking photo, if you didn't assess the tones and colors first, you're not going to have something to build off of. And the reason why is because that data, that raw data, is so malleable in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom that you can push and pull that thing to some extremes, especially with sensors being the way they are. And you can do some incredible things at the raw level to exploit the data there. It's just like an interrogation. I know it's got information, and I'm going to beat the crap out of it. I'm going to move this slider this way, this slider this way, and I'm going to get that information out of there. So that's the cool thing about Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. And I say them like that because now we know that they're pretty much the same thing. So it's not really a versus, it's either or. Right. But then once I give myself permission to do artistic effects, that's where I'm going to go into Photoshop, and I'm going to do things like adding gradients. And there's a lot of benefits to doing things in Photoshop that you don't get in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. And those things would be tools like masking. You can do some masking with local corrections and stuff, but it's not as easy. Blend if you've never heard of blend it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Opacity, fill, blend modes. There are no blend modes in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. So there's a real reason to be able to split and separate and divide out channels. You can't do that stuff in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. Luminosity masking, you can do mild versions of that in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, but not necessarily as easy. So I think the direction and the path that Adobe wants you to go is, I don't really think they care too much if you go into Photoshop. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I'm sure they do because it's like their flagship, but how many people actually want to go into Photoshop? Like, my target demographic, I don't necessarily teach to beginners. I try to, but I can't, so I teach to the intermediate and advanced people who are kind of lost because they don't have a teacher when they're going into the advanced mode. That's why I'm like full on Photoshop. But if I were to teach like a beginner Adobe Camera Raw course, by minute 5, I'd probably lose everyone. It's just one of those things. So I think that there are definitely, though, right? It is. And I think there's a demographic of individuals that definitely wants to take their images further. They get frustrated to a point with Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw where they just can't get it where they want to get that image. So then they use Photoshop, and then they learn Photoshop because there's no end to what you can do in Photoshop. So I think a lot of my workflow, if I were to tell you a percentage, I would say 10% of my workflow on my portfolio images happens at the raw level, and 90% happens in Photoshop.
Interesting. All right. So before we dive into sort of some practical screen sharing stuff, so we looked at it from the perspective of what does Adobe want, which is your money, but they don't really care, right, what you do. They just, in all seriousness, Adobe, they're a for-profit company, but having worked there, they're really passionate about empowering creatives, right? They want to give creatives the tools to create ridiculous and amazing things, but they're also for-profit, and they're responsible to their shareholders. So there's that as well, but they manage that, right? So on that side, when you look at the time investment of this, to people that are watching this and photographers that are saying, you know what, like me, I'm going to speak for myself, you know, and I've got experience with Lightroom. I know my way around that app. I've been seeing blood in the water of maybe I should start considering this other Photoshop workflow, and I'm already a Creative Cloud subscriber. And I'm trying to do a calculus on where I should spend my time, because it shouldn't be about, I'm just going to, you know, marinate in discussions about tools and pixels and AI and all this stuff. At the end of the day, it's about what you create and what the end user who isn't a photographer thinks about what you create, not how you created it. So what advice would you give people? Should folks just say, you know what, I'm going to take the path of least resistance and go into Lightroom and go there? Or, you know, as I'm considering personally, should I dive in and say, you know what, I need to up my game on the Photoshop, Camera Raw, Bridge thing, because it's the operating system for photography, and I can do, there's more that can be done in that combination than I could ever dream of doing in this lifetime that I have right now. So it makes sense to put myself in that workflow. What do you think? What do you say? And those, if somebody's at the fork in the road, they want to go one direction or the other, how would you guide them?
What I would suggest is you have to look at yourself. In Bridge, I'm going to be honest with you, you have to be very deliberate about organization from the very minute you import your photographs, because the import process is completely different. You're basically dragging and dropping things into a folder structure, and there's no ghost files. So if you delete something from Lightroom, it's still on your computer. If you delete something from your computer, it's off your computer. So that's kind of the difference there. If you're in Bridge and you press the delete key on a photo, it will delete the photo. So there's things you have to understand about the difference between them. I would say if you're very organized and you're deliberate about organization, you can get away with the Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw. If you're someone who needs help with organization, then Lightroom is definitely the way to go, because it forces you to do that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep.
So knowing what we know now, that Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw, if we were to slam those two together into one program, is basically the same thing as Lightroom, minus a few things like sharing to social media and building, you know, whatever.
Books and all that stuff. Yeah.
A lot of it also comes down to the type of photographer that you are. So I'm primarily a landscape photographer. So for many of you who don't know what that means that I'm going to go to Arches National Park. I'm going to take 5,642 photos, and I'm going to take one and process it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
You know,
yeah.
But if you're a wedding photographer, you're going to take 10,450 photos, and you're going to process 250 of them and maybe make an album. For that type of workflow, I don't recommend Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw, because there's a lot more benefits to the Lightroom workflow.
Yeah.
So
I didn't think about that. Yeah.
When I was photographing my son's football games, I could import all 250 photos into Adobe Camera Raw, but it was really slow, because Adobe Camera Raw is the develop engine, right? So whereas Lightroom says this is the cataloging part, this is develop part, when you put it all into Adobe Camera Raw, it's going to slow your workflow down. So I had to drag in like 30 images at a time to do that. Now there are some people that will edit, you know, many photos all at once, but with these raw files being so big, I didn't want to edit all of them and slow down my computer. So you can definitely do it. And I was definitely able to edit, you know, 250 to 300 football pictures from an afternoon in about, you know, 30 minutes or less, you know, because once you get one done, you just sync settings and you're good to go, which you can do that from Bridge as well, where you edit one and then you sync all the settings just like you would in Lightroom. So it just depends on the flow, man. I think, you know, with Lightroom, I think the definite advantage is the speed at which it operates once you are editing a mass amount of photos. But for me, I just really need to look at those photos, see which one's going to be the best. And with landscape photography, it comes down to that single moment a lot of times, where I'm sitting there for, you know, 6 hours waiting for the sun to set. And I take a lot of pre-comp shots where I'm building my composition while I'm on location. And then once that magic happens, I go back to one of those spots that I documented, and that becomes my shot. You know what I mean? The light has to set up right. And I'm speaking for, you know, the perfect landscape photo. Obviously there's times where I do go out and take 10 or 15 that I'm happy with. But for the most part, for me, as a landscape photographer or a one-off photographer, it doesn't really make too much sense for me to be stuck with a Lightroom workflow if it doesn't match the way my brain works. And that's another thing we have to talk about with this, whether you're working with Capture One, Adobe Camera Raw, Lightroom, On One, Luminar, it doesn't matter. There are programs that just don't map to my brain. There are programs that I've opened that I'm like, who did they design this for? A robot or a human? You know what I mean? So I think that you have to be able to decide, is this workflow or is this program going to be conducive to my workflow by the way I think and operate? So for me, Capture One just doesn't work. I open it up and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm just stunned, right? But then Adobe Camera Raw is so simplistic and so easy. Lightroom, same thing, simplistic, easy, and it gets the job done. So I think you just have to say to yourself, what do I shoot? What types of programs do I want to look at for a long period of time? Because we're going to be in there for a while. And is the subject matter that I shoot going to be conducive for the workflow that I decide to take?
I love that. I love that. And what you said at the beginning of that was really, really eye-opening. You have to consider the volume that you're shooting. The photographers that's in search of that one good image of, of this landscape, and just looking for that one hero or a couple of heroes versus a volume shooter who needs to do hundreds or thousands or review them and then pick selects and edit and make a book and all that stuff. Yeah. So that should factor into the decision-making process. One last thing I'm going to throw in there. This might be a little controversial, so brace yourself. The artificial intelligence. That's another fork in the road, right? Artificial intelligence versus learning how to do it, quote unquote, the hard way. So for example, sky replacement, you could do sky replacement using luminosity masking and, all sorts of magic within Photoshop, right? You could do that. We could do that before all this AI stuff happened. It was harder, but you could do it. Now we have AI. Where do you, Blake Rudis, fall on the argument of, hey, we're at a point now where we can let AI, artificial intelligence, or computational photography take some of the load off of us. So if I want to change that sky, I can use AI to do it, and I don't have to worry about Bridge, Photoshop, and all that stuff. I can just do it in this app and round trip back into Photoshop or whatever app I'm using. What do you say to that?
I see. I'm okay with AI in terms of enlarging, noise reduction, sharpening, menial things, right? Like things that don't really mean a whole lot. I am adamantly against AI for artistic expression. So, and when I say adamantly, I should probably say more like vehemently, or like I could go on with these big. And the thing is like, I'm a very emotive person. So when I go out and I take my landscape shots, there have been times where I've cried in front of those landscapes. I'm not going to lie, because they are so powerful and they're so impacting that they've moved me to take this picture. And then for me to take a piece of my heart out and throw it into this work, mash it in there, grind it in there, so that when the other person, which I'm not sure if I'm going to be there when they see it, can feel what I felt. Right. Mm-hmm. That's my goal. Mm-hmm. My goal is to build an experience for my viewer and not show them a pretty picture. And that building that experience has to do with how I navigate light, how I direct light, where I push and pull things. So for things like, AI programs that are going to change the look of the image based on what AI thinks an image should look like, to me is complete trash. I've even used them and I'm like, why on earth would I even use this? I did a video on this on YouTube and I'm like, this isn't even a good starting place. Like if I were to even do my workflow of tone, color, and effects and even try to use this for the tone and color part before I get into my effects in Photoshop, I'd be chasing my tail trying to fix things that these AI programs thought were correct. So these things can't feel like we feel. They can't. Until I get to a point where the AI software that I'm using, I can plug in a series of emotions and I can maybe even put a USB cable into my head and then press go. Maybe, just maybe, would I be on board with it. But at this point and at this stage, I'm not for these programs, because to me, it just looks like they make your image a mess. And don't try to give any of these AI programs an overexposed or underexposed photo, because it's going to look even more like trash. That's where you have to make those decisions in Adobe Camera Raw Lightroom to push and pull those highlights, push and pull those shadows, and really bring these things out. I mean, I've shown countless examples of this with some of my work where I took my portfolio pieces and I stacked them against AI to see if AI could even come close. And a lot of times it was just like, really, are you kidding me? But the problem with that is that beginners might say, well, oh, this gets me out to take pictures more often. And to me, I only take, like, to me, photography is like even 10% in camera, 90% out of it. And if you did any analog stuff, it's very much the same thing. When you're in the darkroom, you're building that print and you're building that from, light, and it's a process. So to say that you can get me in and out of my computer faster so I can shoot more just means I can take a whole lot of more crappy photos without getting my artistic expression out there. Yeah. So I don't like it, because I think when beginners see that, they're like, oh, this is something that I can embrace because it's going to speed up my workflow. And then when they press this button that's supposed to make this thing look better, they say, oh, that's what a sunset's supposed to look like. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then they submit it to one of my critique sessions and I want to gouge my eyes out. It's like, of course, I'm a lot nicer about that stuff. I would never put somebody down, especially because a lot of times when they're asking for a critique, they're showing you their best work. But, that's the problem. The problem is that some people may not be able to differentiate what is good and what is bad because they pushed a button that said it should be good.
Yeah. I think a lot of it goes back to audience too. Like having spoken to the folks over at Skyloom about Luminar and Luminar AI, I know that they're targeting, maybe not exclusively, but part of their target are people that aren't us, that aren't people that consider themselves content creators, image makers, photographers, etc. Part of their target is the beauty bloggers and a restaurant owner that needs to take pictures of the new dish to put out on Instagram, or, people that just have a innate need for imagery that looks good enough to put out there, versus the artisan that's going to obsess over every little pixel and this and that, I need to take that tree out and all that stuff. They're not specifically targeting those people, although they do want those people in. They're not targeting them. So I think it splits the audience, right? So, and it makes sense on either side. And then last question before we, and I keep saying this, but the last question before we dive into your show and tell, the other apps out there, right? So we've got Capture One, for example, which is very popular as an alternative to Lightroom and in some cases Photoshop. A lot of people are using Capture One. A lot of professionals, high-end professionals, are using Capture One tethered, bringing their images in. They can't see themselves doing anything else other than Capture One. They say the raw processing engine within Capture One is superior to Camera Raw. They say the way that the application just overall works and feels is more modern and more polished than that of Photoshop. I know you're not an expert in Capture One, but what do if you're having that coffee shop discussion about one versus the other, how do you respond to that?
I have a license to probably every photo software out there, and it's just because I want to see what's out there. I want to see what Capture One has to offer. I own Capture One. I have On One. I have Topaz. I have Luminar. I have all that stuff, and every time they come out with one, I buy it. And it's really just because I want to see where the industry is moving to make sure that I still stand on my ground the right way, and I don't ever want to get complacent or say, oh, that's how I've always done it. I've been in the National Guard too long to embrace that. But when it comes to what should you use and are there viable alternatives? I always think that there's viable alternatives, but I think a lot of that has to do with how does that map out to your brain to, go with something that you're going to be able to get work done in. I've heard a lot of great things about Capture One. A lot of my peers use Capture One too. And, there is the idea that it could be superior to Adobe Camera or Lightroom. But then I think to myself, like, if I'm doing just fine here, why would I need to go that way? And then if I open up and I do a side-by-side comparison of the two images and I'm like, well, it's not that much different. I just have to learn a new piece of software. Until Adobe just drops a bomb and just destroys Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, they no longer exist. I'm going to stay in that path. It's just
Right.
because I'm used to it. I like it. I'm efficient with it. And those are key words. Those are buzzwords: proficiency, efficiency, workflow. These are things that are going to be inherently different for each individual person, right? So as long as you know and you're aware that the thing that you're using is making you more efficient, it's making you more proficient, and it is helping your workflow, then by all means use whatever you want, because we talked about this and joked about this at the beginning. Like if I put my work in a gallery and somebody walked up, they're drinking their wine, they go, "Oh, great use of Adobe Camera Raw, Blake." Nobody in their right mind would ever say that. Like they wouldn't know, And then in my artist statement, it's not going to be like, "Well, I'm strictly an Adobe Camera Raw user, and this is how I do it to make my artwork." No, an artist statement is more emotive and it's evocative and it's emotions. So at the end of the day, if you're producing good work, it is what it is. If you're happy with where you are, I'm not trying to convince anybody by any stretch of imagination to be in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom or, but I think that, just go with what is working for you and keep going if it's working for you,
Exactly. And if you're at that level, I mean, let's put it in a box and be real about it, right? So we're splitting hairs at the level of making a decision between an F-16 and an ATF fighter, right? It's like both of them are going to get the job done. Both you're not going to approach the operational limits in either one of those aircraft, especially operating at our levels. So having an argument that this one can go Mach 3 and that one can go Mach 6, you're never going to break the speed of sound at your level of work probably. So you don't need to worry about Mach 3 or Mach 6, right? So choose the one that the seat feels best in, that you like the look of, and go to town and go do the job. So
that's why I would take an AC-130, I think.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
I mean, you can't go Mach speed, but you could put that thing on autopilot, make cookies, and decimate a city. I mean, that's
and
awesome.
Put tanks in it, right?
Exactly. AC-130, man. I'm partial. I'm at a one.
To fly those. You've really? Flown in those before, right? Yeah.
No, we have 130s at my base though, but we don't have AC-130s.
No, just 130s. Yeah. Remember, I'm old school. I'm back in the dark ages when dinosaurs were ruling the earth. So even though I don't look like it.
You don't at all. You got that serum, man. I don't know what it is.
It's a super soldier serum, man. You got to get it.
You do kind of look like Falcon a little bit there. Yeah,
I'll take that. I'll take that. I'm a big Anthony Mackie fan, man. He's cool.
There you go.
Let's dive in. Let's dive into some show and tell. Show me okay. What you got. I think folks want to see the Blake Rudis using the tool. That didn't sound right. Using Photoshop.
The tool using the tool.
Using the tool, cool.
All right. So this is a good example. I use this a lot of times as an example image. Can you see this?
Yep. See
it. Okay. Is this going to be an audio only thing, or is there also going to be like video?
There'll be video too. Yeah. So folks that are listening to the podcast version of this, the audio version, just head over to thisweekinphoto.com and you can see the video, or if you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, you'll see this.
Okay. I was going to narrate like what you're seeing is an underexposed photo of Ruby Beach.
Please do the Bob Ross. Do Bob Ross with the happy little rocks.
So there's a couple of C stacks here, and these are way underexposed. And this is actually, for anyone who might be looking at this, thinking, Blake, do you know how to use a camera? I do, I promise you. But as a landscape photographer, I routinely do things like this, where I'm underexposing for things in the foreground, especially when the sunset in the background is such a strong sunset in the background. This is where we have some of those things that are very difficult. The difficult situations. It's easy to run a regular photograph through here that's already got the perfect exposure and see that everything's fine. But to really see the extent of what you can draw up in a raw file is the important part. So, there's a lot of like nerdy stuff that's happened over the course of raw editing. If you go back to our day, like in the 2007 era, like I told you when I first opened Lightroom, it was like, oh, so I've got some sliders here. Well, now we've gotten to this point where we add profiles and we have presets and we have all this cool stuff that gets involved in here. So I'm a big proponent of actually doing a lot of my work in Photoshop first on things that are called LUTs, and then using those LUTs to create a profile. And what that does is it doesn't modify any of your settings that you see here in Adobe Camera Raw. but it does modify the look of the image. Now, when you see the profile here, you've got, your landscape profile. That's essentially Adobe that has made a profile that makes your landscape images look better through the use of probably some form of lookup table or color table, right? So this is why I'm telling you, man, I can't teach beginners. I get nerdy like right off the bat. But anyway, so honestly, the first thing I do when I open up an image in Adobe Camera Raw is I press the auto button. So that might sound like a cop-out, but what the auto button does now, as opposed to what it used to do in the past, the auto button now actually does a great job of opening up the dynamic range in your photograph to expose your shadows and highlights. And it does it differently from image to image. In the past, if you ever press the auto button, it was like it did the same thing on every photo. Whereas now it actually looks at your histogram, takes a good sampling of it, and opens up the dynamic range. So I'll start with auto because it's easier. Then I might drop down the highlights to get that resurrected in the back, and then bring up those shadows a little bit so that I get more of the foreground in there. And at this point, I can start assessing like what's wrong with this image. And this is where I talk about the tone and color aspect of my workflow. At this point, I have done the tonal corrections to get this to be what my eye saw. What most people don't realize is that our eyes can see up to 24 stops of dynamic range at any given time, right? Our camera can only capture one instance of dynamic range at any given time, but it has the ability within it to open up that dynamic range. That's why we move the highlights and shadows so we can get it to look more like what we saw. I used to come from the old school days of HDR. My old blog was Everyday HDR. I don't do HDR every day, but guess what? This is a form of HDR. We're heightening the dynamic range in the photograph, okay? So now looking at it, I can tell that my white balance is off because things are looking a little green and yellow. So I'm going to bring my magenta over here a little bit to get some of that green to go away. And then I might even incorporate a little bit more of this yellow here to get some of that back. Now that I look at that, it looks pretty good. So cool. That's essentially, the basics of what we would do back in 2007, right? Mm-hmm. But even then, we didn't have the dynamic range and a sensor to give us this. So one of the things that I always recommend to people on top of the efficiency of the program is know your camera sensor. I know what I can do with my Sony A1 and A7R III. I know how far I can push those raw files because I experiment with them on underexposed and overexposed. So I know that my Sonys are not good with blown highlights, but they can crush some really dark shadows, right? Like amazing details can be resurrected from these things. So you have to know the limits of your raw file to begin with in order to be able to extract this kind of detail. But one of the things I do want to show you here is I've created these things that are basically called like intelligent profiles and presets is what I'm calling them. And they're profiles, just like we saw at the beginning of this with Adobe Camera Raw, that work with presets. So a lot of times you see a profile or you see a preset, right? And you don't really see a profile interacting with a preset, nor do you see a preset that does something with a profile. They're usually separate. So now I've actually gotten my workflow down to a couple clicks by going over into the preset section. I can work with these intelligent profiles and I can start looking at how I want to change the colors and tones in this image from some of the profiles that I've built in the past. Like this one here, I call it the kitchen sink because it does a lot of crazy stuff. But like the everything bagel, it might make it look atrocious at first, but look at the color that it brings out at the raw level. Now we haven't gone into Photoshop yet. Essentially what's happened here is I'm using techniques that I built in Photoshop and incorporating them into these profiles so that I get Photoshop level editing at the raw level. You see, we just went from like nerd to hyper nerd.
I love that. But just to draw a circle around profiles versus presets. So my understanding was a profile was like for your A7R III, right? You'd say, okay, here's a profile for how this particular camera behaves. Maybe it has these kind of idiosyncrasies to it, like chromatic aberration or whatever. And this profile knows that and compensates for that. And then a preset is more on the develop side. That's my, you're kind of putting those two together.
Yeah. So essentially what's happening here is think of like curves adjustment layers, selective color adjustment layers, crazy, adjustment layers in Photoshop that have been turned into a profile so that when you bring it into Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, it will change and alter the look of the photograph. It doesn't matter what camera it came from. These have all been built in Photoshop essentially to create this. So what a profile does is think of it like it rests on the top of all of your work. Okay. So if you're working in Adobe Camera Raw and you put a profile on there, a LUT-based profile specifically, and LUT stands for lookup table. So if you put a lookup table profile on the image like this, it's going to look at all the data underneath it and say, okay, when Blake made this lookup table, black turned into a medium gray and white turned into a medium gray. Therefore, if I see that in this image, I'm going to make black or white medium gray. But it doesn't do anything with the sliders. It doesn't even touch the sliders because this is all mapped out before the image has even met the lookup table yet, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
So the difference here is that, like, if I put this one on here called the everything bagel, and then I go back over to my basic settings, as I start to modify the colors in here, it's interacting with the colors that are baked into that lookup table to create this amazing freaking sunset. I gotta laugh a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, look at that. Like, that's one profile. Now, if I were to change those settings back to Adobe Color, it's like, meh. Right?
Yeah.
So
now that's someplace I want to be. I want to be there with my girlfriend with a glass of wine on that second shot. So
yeah. You know, and I didn't even prep for this when Frederick was like, "You're going to show us something," I was like, "Oh, yep, sure." So then after I select the profile, I've got these presets, and these presets were specifically made in mind with the profiles that I've got here that will then alter those tones a little bit further for me based on like a boost in contrast or a boost in dynamic range or deeper highlights or, you know, deeper midtones or something like that. This is getting kind of on the magenta side, but we can alter that later, you know. Then when I go into my colors, I've got the same thing here where I can offset the colors here or boost the colors here. And this is all happening at the raw level, you know, like this is why I like the Adobe. So I think before we were talking about all the other things that are out there, this just has the perfect marriage for me because now I'm working in Photoshop, thinking about my images in Photoshop. And if I want to make a lookup table, as long as I don't use any masking in that lookup table and there's no pixels in the adjustments that I'm doing other than the base pixels of the background image, I can turn anything into a lookup table. So think of things like gradient maps, curves adjustment layers, selective color adjustment layers, HSL adjustment layers. All of those can be used to create a lookup table. Nice. So now I've got Photoshop level stuff happening in Adobe Camera Raw, right? So now I can start to get, I'll use this one. I think I like that one. And then in this tools section, I basically have a couple of different things like noise reduction and sharpening. And if you need any of that stuff, this is getting a little bit on the magenta side. So let's pull some of that away. Now, what you'll notice is that that magenta slider is interacting with that LUT. Right. So these temperature sliders here actually play a big role now, much further beyond white balance, because this is now color control. You see the difference here?
Yeah.
So that becomes pretty powerful and pretty effective stuff. Now, if we were to change this to the Adobe Color again, I mean, look at it. It looks like mud. But now think of it this way. So this is the image that I'm going to bring into Photoshop. So when I open this in Photoshop, I've got a ton of color. I've got a ton of data. I've got a horizon line that's not straight that I'll fix in a second. But I've got so much more here in this image than I did in Adobe Camera Raw. If I were to come in for just a raw file without doing anything to it, you know what I mean? Or just doing the basic stuff.
Yep.
So let me go into the crop tool.
This is your starting point, right? So
this becomes the starting point.
So for the folks that are doing, like, say, infrared photography, I knew you were going to fix that horizon because your ADD was kicking in, or your OCD, the OCD was kicking in. But the folks that are doing like infrared photography, and you know the images, the raw images from an infrared modified camera come in looking, you know, not optimal. So would you use this sort of profile, you know, make it great before I bring it into Photoshop flow for that workflow as well, or just bring it in raw and tweak it inside of Photoshop?
Absolutely. So my French buddy and I, his name's Tony G. Him and I got together and built actually a whole process for infrared people. Like we have probably the most complex infrared process on the planet, but not complicated. It's just complex. It's very much the same thing. So you'll make a profile we've got it to a point where we've got profiles in Adobe Camera Raw that will make it look, I mean, you can do your whole editing process in Adobe Camera Raw in an infrared image, which sounds unheard of for a lot of people who shoot infrared, but we aren't messing with JPEGs anymore. We are a straight raw editing powerhouse in infrared. So
go raw or go home.
Exactly. So then, looking at this here, there's many things that I could do to the image now, but what I wanted to showcase here was that, let's say I want to choose like a gradient or something like that to make the background. Actually, let's do it. I'll do this thing called a gradient spotlight. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this gradient to a radial gradient. And you would say, well, Blake, why don't you just use the radial filter in Adobe Camera Raw? Well, I'll tell you, there's more. There's always more. So with this, I'm going to add a color to it. So it's going to be a slight kind of warming color based off of something that I see in the image. So it'll be like maybe a lighter version of that orange. Okay. And then press OK. Okay. And now this radial filter looks like trash. For anybody who's watching this, please feel free to, belittle me or something like that, make fun of me. But if I change the blend mode to something like linear light is a blend mode that works off of fill and not opacity. A lot of people think that the linear light blend mode is a joke, but it's not. It's actually the best blend mode in Photoshop. But if we take the fill and we drop the fill down on this now becomes like an interactive spotlight. So if I double click this, watch. Here's where the oohs and ahs come. Whoa. Now that's a radial gradient, but if I change that to something like a diamond gradient, we can get that like spray of the sun, that's coming out here. That's showing my sensor dust spots up there that I need to fix too. But even something like a reflected gradient where it's like a band of light that goes from left to right. And then from there, I would then just brush out maybe on this rock in the foreground because I don't want that band of light on there to hit that. Okay. So then that becomes in the dark. And then over here, we get that light. So these are the benefits of Photoshop over Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom that you're just not going to get this level of, of play. Yeah. And it's fast and it's easy. Like, yeah, you can do local adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, and they're all fine and well there, but they aren't responsive. They're slow. They're clunky. Even the auto masking there, it's slow and it's clunky. And that's any raw editing process or any raw software. Photoshop was specifically designed for layers. So that's why this is the best place to do that. And then this would just become a build-up process. If I wanted to add curves, or if I wanted to add more color, or if I wanted to add a vignette, or whatever I wanted to do to incorporate some more mood or emotion into this photograph, I would do that here at Adobe Camera Raw or here at Photoshop rather than Adobe Camera Raw.
So here's before we end this, so here's another curveball in here. So you're building up these layers and you got the image to pretty much where you want it to go. I've seen a lot of Photoshop artists at this point, they would throw another adjustment layer on top that is a Camera Raw adjustment layer, right?
Yeah. Why, so what you're talking about now.
Why do you do that? If you're sandwiching, you're starting with Camera Raw, you're doing some edits, and now you're putting a Camera Raw filter on top of everything. Why? Why are we doing
that Camera Raw filter is not actually Camera Raw. It's actually Camera Raw, the filter or the plugin. Let's call it a plugin. They could have called it anything else, honestly, because it's completely different. So if I make a stamp of this, I'll use this little claw thing. It's Control, Shift, Alt, and E, which will make a stamp of everything that just happened underneath here. And that's what I would do that on, because Adobe Camera Raw isn't an adjustment layer, it's a filter. So you won't find it in the adjustment layers. You'll go up to Filter and then go to Adobe Camera Raw or press Control, Shift, A. In here, I'll show you the differences. So some people immediately think that they're in Adobe Camera Raw right now. You're not. You're in Adobe Camera Raw filter. There's two ways to find out. You don't have a thumbnail thing on the side, the film strip anywhere. You also won't have a crop tool in here. If you don't see a crop tool in here, you're in Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Not that that's a problem. It just means that you're not working in native Adobe Camera Raw. I actually did a YouTube video on this to explain this to people because the data that you're working with at this level is not raw data. This is pixel data from Photoshop that you are now working on in Adobe Camera Raw, the plugin.
See, another layer, right?
Yes, literally, it's another layer.
Yeah.
This is the stinky part of the onion, which is not a bad thing. It's just that, I mean, you still have access to all, I mean, I could go back in here and throw another profile on top of here. I could throw, I could do anything with my presets because they're all part of it. The big difference here too, is that in optics, you're not going to be able to change the what do you call it? The stinking profile for the lens. And the reason why, because it doesn't know what lens you used. Why? Because you're working on pixels right now, not a raw file, right? So those are a couple giveaways. What will happen here is that you won't be able to push these sliders as far. Now you can still push them pretty far, but you're pushing basically JPEG data, right? You're not pushing raw data. So that's the difference between Adobe Camera Raw as a filter and Adobe Camera Raw the plugin. But it can be a great thing.
Do you use it
every once in a while? Yeah. So like that sensor dust spot up there. I mean, I can use some of my cleanup tools in here if I wanted to, or I could use Adobe Camera Raw if I had a lot of them, because I think Adobe Camera Raw is much faster at that and better at that. And in my new process, so Control Shift Alt and A, which I haven't released this yet. It's coming out at the end of the month. But what I do a lot of black and white photography. So people think, well, do you start your image in black and white? No, I start my image with a tone and color image like this, get it really good looking. And then I go into black and white because I consider black and white an artistic effect. So at this point, I've basically turned that same engine that I built with those profiles into black and white profiles that I can use at the end of my workflow. And I can turn Adobe Camera Raw into this epic black and white processing machine, and I've got some starting point profiles here that really help with that. Some of them are going to be better than others for this sake, but this one is going to give me like that deep dark kind of black and white feel. And then I can add that mood and emotion in here by adjusting my sliders here to incorporate some more tonal value in here. And now I'm not using the auto button because I'm using that specifically to make my blacks and my whites brighter and darker, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people might look at this and say, well, Blake, why is your color grading at the bottom of this and not mixed in the middle? The settings that you see here that I have in this order are what I consider the priority of how Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom looks at your image and assesses the tonal and color quality in the photograph. It's a long, drawn out explanation, right? But basically color grading happens at the end. So on top of that LUT, I can actually manipulate a lot of the highlights and shadows here to really get this to pure white and pure black and push this to an emotive and evocative black and white photograph versus the mud that I would typically get. And I can show you that if I were to open this in Adobe Camera or open this back in Photoshop and then just give you a basic idea of what this would look like if we were to convert that in Adobe Camera Raw regularly. That's what it would look like if you converted it regularly. This is what happens when you use that as a raw processing machine, kind of. Wow. So you see the difference.
Yeah. Wow. It's so much to learn. So speaking of that, let's wrap it up here, at least this recorded part of this for the podcast, and put a bow on this. There was no way we're going to obviously get into or making this discussion at the beginning, you didn't know anything about this stuff. At the end, now you know everything. Where this is not that kind of party. If people want to learn more about this stuff, you've made your life's work basically around teaching this kind of stuff and showing people how to get the most out of Photoshop, et cetera. Where should they go? What's the best place to go on your channel or on your website for them to learn more about Photoshop?
Well, the thing is, if you just try to find me or I tell you one place, there's going to be so much information. So the best thing, like if you're looking for this type of stuff and learning Adobe Camera Raw and really diving in deep, there's this package I created called Intelligent Profiles and Presets. It's IP squared, Intelligent Profiles and Presets. And I'll give you a link for that. And that is basically those profiles and those presets that you saw here. But it also, I teach you all the inner workings on what's happening there. I teach you how to make your own. I'm the kind of guy who, I don't want you to buy my profiles and presets forever. I don't, because I don't want to make them forever. I want to teach you how to fish, but more importantly, I want to teach you where to throw your net and at what time of day to put it in there to get the most fish so you're not there all day. So that's essentially what the IP Intelligent Profiles and Presets are for. It's a deep dive into this stuff. So we go into the deep nerdy stuff, but you can also scratch the surface if you want. Even in the videos, I even tell you, like, if you don't want to get this nerdy, just stop watching right now. You can be just fine with what you just learned, or you can go real deep. And I take it pretty deep.
Love it. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is the challenge, I think, for a lot of people is creatives tend to be inherently one side of the brain. What is it, left brain for creative or right brain? I always get those mixed up. But the technical side of this, and learning what all this stuff does and profiles and modes and all this stuff is technical, and it plays on one side of the brain. And the trick is making it inform the creative side or power the creative side. So the two sides of your brain have to work together, and then you can literally create magic. You and I were looking at an Instagram channel before we started this. In fact, I'll share this real quick. Actually, I'll share it when we do our discussion. But let's wrap this up now. So again, the URL for people to go to, just for the people that are listening and not watching.
Oh, I don't have a short link for it. It's going to be
just F64 Academy.
F64 Academy. Yeah, if you just want to find me in general, F64 Academy. And if you get on my email list, I'm the type of person who actually responds. So if you email me anything, you're going to get a response. That's like my guarantee. Because if you're going to waste your time emailing me, I'm going to waste my time. I mean, if you're going to spend your time emailing me, I'm going to spend my time getting back to you. I'm just kidding. But if
you're going to send me nonsense, I'm going to send you nonsense.
I'm going to spam you too. No, I genuinely want to see people grow. It's like how I built my business to begin with, is giving away as much as I can. And I want to do that for you as well. So if you're interested in that, jump on the email list. And if you say, hey, I saw you on that podcast and I want that link, I'll get that over to you.
Fantastic. All right, Blake Rudis, thank you, sir. I'm excited. I'm going to dive in and I'm going to be sending you emails with my questions. So stand by for that.
Let's do it.
All right. Take care. This is TWiP.